Welcome, everybody. I would like to thank you all for coming to this event on Native activism and autonomy, sponsored by the McCarthy Center. I want to first acknowledge that we are on Dakota and Ojibwe land. Qoyayugan ka makut mavet tailchatnik kanak sachtorolugu kailin yuppachalich balachatnik kwanu umiolchutik sachtoroluting. I have the pleasure of introducing Joseph Halloran. Mr. Halloran is a Johnny alum from the class of 1989. In 1994, he graduated cum laude from William Mitchell College of Law. He has dedicated his career to serving indigenous communities in Minnesota as well as across the United States, and he, as an attorney and legal consultant. Doing this, he's represented tribes fighting to protect their children, their environment, and their independence. His career embodies our institution's Benedictine values as he illustrates how these values can be applied to serve indigenous communities. Please help me welcome Joe Halloran, who will introduce our panelists.
Is this live? Is this live? Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Joe Halloran, I'm more often referred to as Sam's dad. My son Sam is a senior here, political science major, and soon to be a graduate. I'm really proud to introduce this panel. They've been friends of mine for 25 years, and more importantly, been mentors of mine since I first started trying to figure out what the practice of federal Indian law looked like. And they all took me under their wing in different ways and were very patient with me and taught me really what I know today. So I'm super grateful to have them here. When Professor Gordon was looking to put together a panel, I reached out to these folks right away, and I'm very excited that they were not only willing to come here and to share their wisdom, but to make it here on a night like tonight. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel. I'll start actually with Professor Gordon. And short story on this program is, in a roundabout way, I was introduced to Professor Gordon through the editor of the Abbey Banner, and we were sharing our ideas on different research issues, and the idea of this panel came up, and Professor Gordon talked with the folks at the McCarthy Center, Professor Bell, and it is really as a result of his dedication and passion that this came to be, so thank you. Professor Gordon is a PhD from University of California, Riverside in sociocultural anthropology, and has an MA from the University of California, Riverside in anthropology. He's been a professor at St. Ben's in the sociology department for 6 years, also teaches the first year seminar for freshman students. He's also an author, wrote the book, The Comier Nation Activism and Tribal Casino Movement, that was just published by the University of Nevada Press in 2008, and also in his free time serves on research committee for the Central Minnesota Community Empowerment Organization, a nonprofit that serves refugees in need. Next in line is Chairwoman Cathy Achievers. She's a member of the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa and was elected as tribal chairwoman of the band in 2016 after serving 4 years as a district representative on the band's governing body, the Reservation Tribal Council. Chairwoman Chavers was also elected as the first female president of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which is the governing body made up of elected officials from the 6 constituent Chippewa bands. Chairwoman Chavers worked for 25 years in health administration, including the important role of delivering health care services in Indian country as a patient benefits coordinator at the band's Indian Health Service Clinic, and received special recognition for her work with IHS. Ms. Chavers served as a co-chair of the National Indian Health Services Work Group for Purchased and Referred Care. She has been looked to by many in the industry for her expertise in health administration, and was a helpful resource in explaining the impacts of the recent federal government shutdown on the delivery of essential health care in Indian country, and specifically at the Bois Forte Band. Chairwoman Chavers has been involved in private business for years, working in her family's wild rice processing plant for decades and taking over ownership of the business after the passing of her parents, Murph and Dolores O'Connell. She brought that experience and her experience in the complex world of health administration in Indian country to tribal government and is looked to as a practical voice to tribal governance and the challenges involved in delivering the best quality governmental services to band members. Chairwoman Chavers was appointed to and has served on the Governor's Women's Foundation for Young Women Leaders and the Governor's Advisory Committee on Results First and Connected Automated Vehicles, which we're going to have to hear about more. And this evening, my law partner sent me a photograph from 1912 that depicts Chairwoman Chavers' grandmother and Mr. Johnson's grandmother, 1912, at the Vermilion Indian School. It was pretty neat. So welcome, Chairwoman Chavers. Next is Chief Executive Melanie Benjamin. She is the Chief Executive of the non-removable Mille Band of Ojibwe and leads the executive branch in the band's three-branch division of powers system of government. The Chief Executive implements band laws and programs and conducts external relations on behalf of the band with all governments and political subdivisions. Chief Executive Benjamin was first elected in 2000 and has been re-elected to subsequent terms in 2004, 8, 12, and 16. From 1989 to 1997, Chief Executive Benjamin served as Chief of Staff to the late Tribal Chairman and Chief Executive Arthur Gabo, and after his passing under the late Chief Executive Marge Anderson. Chief Executive Benjamin has also served as the Senior Vice President of Administration and Finance at Grand Casino Hinckley. She's been on many boards and organizations throughout the state and nation and currently serves as the Secretary of the Native American Finance Officers Association, known as NAFOA, and is a board member of the American Indian Law Resource Center, Indian Legal Assistance Program, the Minnesota Board on Aging, Women Empowering Women in Indian Nations, which she co-founded, the U.S. Attorney General's Tribal Nations Leadership Council, co-chair of the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities Tribal Nation Advisory Task Force, and most recently, in all of her spare time, served on the Walls-Flanagan Transition Team. Under Chief Executive Benjamin's leadership, I'm sorry if I mix up Chair, Chief Executive, my apologies. So Chief Executive Benjamin's leadership, the Mille Band, has achieved economic diversification through leveraging its expertise in hospitality industry. And the band now owns a hotel in downtown St. Paul, in Minneapolis, and in Oklahoma City. She led Mille to become the second tribe in the nation to achieve concurrent federal jurisdiction under the Tribal Law and Order Act, and is passionate about education for Indian students and tirelessly works to achieve legislation allowing for improved education for children in the BIA and tribal education systems. Her battles today include protecting public safety while fighting the spread of violence, defending the treaty territory and homeland of the Mille Band, and in reestablishing and enhancing intergovernmental cooperative law enforcement agreements and serving on the front lines of fighting the opioid epidemic. She's been the recipient of the Tim Wapato Sovereignty Warrior Award, the National Indian Gaming Commission awarded in 2015. Also in 2015, the Great Women of Indian Gaming. In 2005, the J. Silverhills Achievement Award, the Norman Crooks Memorial Eagle Award, and more recently in 2018, the Orville Freeman Award for service to Greater Minnesota in agriculture. She earned her Master's of Education at the University of Minnesota Duluth and a BS in Business Administration from Bemidji State University. She is the mother of a son, Clayton, and the proud grandmother of 4 beautiful grandchildren. Welcome, Chief. Next, I'm pleased to introduce my dear friend, Chairwoman Karen Diver, an enrolled member of the Fond du Lac Band of Chippewa. She is the inaugural faculty fellow for Inclusive Excellence for Native American Affairs at College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. After having served as faculty for the Masters in Tribal Governance program at the University of Minnesota Duluth, teaching leadership and ethics. Karen served as the first ever chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band from 2007 to 15. The chair serves as the head of the tribal governing body and the CEO of the reservation's corporate boards. The Fond du Lac Reservation is the second largest employer in northern Minnesota with over 2,200 employees. She also served as vice president of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, again, the governing body comprised of the leadership of the 6 member bands. She was taken away from Fond du Lac by the Obama administration when she was appointed by President Barack Obama as the special assistant to the president for Native American Affairs and served in that position from November 15th until the end of the Republic as we know it. I mean, the end of the Obama administration. As part of the Domestic Policy Council, Ms. Diver assisted with interagency efforts, policy and regulatory changes to benefit 567 Native American tribes. She has served for 3 years as the Director of Special Projects for Fond du Lac and for 11 years as the Executive Director of the YWCA in Duluth. Karen has served 6 years on the board, Minnesota Council for Nonprofits, Board of Directors, and the Women's Foundation of Minnesota with 2 terms as chair on both boards. Karen is the founding member of the American Indian Community Housing Organization, the Duluth Community Action Program, the Duluth Human Rights Commission. She was an appointee of President Obama to the State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resiliency and co-chaired the Natural Resources Committee of that body. Karen currently serves on the Board of Governors of the Honoring Nations Program of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. She has a bachelor's in economics from the University of Minnesota Duluth, and as the 2002 Bush Leadership Fellow, she received a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Welcome, Chairwoman Diver. I'm also very pleased to introduce to you a long-time mentor of mine and friend, Tad Johnson. Tad is an enrolled member of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Bois Forte Band and has been a professor for nearly a decade. He's currently the director of the Master of Tribal Administration and Governance and full professorship in the department. Tad served as a tribal attorney for more than 30 years, but he also served as a tribal court judge, a tribal administrator, a federal executive administrator, counsel to the Congressional Committee, and is a frequent lecturer on American Indian history and federal Indian law. His expertise in Indian law, tribal sovereignty, and tribal self-determination are skills that cause him to be sought out by people across Indian country. He spent 5 years on the U.S. House of Representatives, working at the U.S. House of Representatives, ultimately becoming staff director and counsel of the Subcommittee on Native American Indian Affairs, now known as the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs, I believe. In 1997, President Clinton appointed Professor Johnson to chair the National Indian Gaming Commission, which is an executive entity that is responsible for providing technical assistance and regulatory guidance to a $30 billion Indian gaming industry. He earned his BA, he earned his BA from the University of St. Thomas. We've given him a special pass today if he admits who won the football game this past fall. And got his law degree. In his law degree from the University of Minnesota, he has served as a faculty member of the National Judicial College and has served on the board of the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. He's currently on the board of the Native Governance Center, serves as director of the Tribal Sovereignty Institute, and is on the board of trustees of the Udall Foundation. He also has served as an attorney, counselor, and an advisor for the Mille Band of Ojibwe for as long as I can remember, and I believe has served as its Solicitor General 4 different times. And again, a great mentor, a great guide through Indian country to me, and a great resource to lawyers in Indian country. I welcome Ted Johnson.
Thank you, Joe, for those wonderful introductions. Bonjour, hello, and thank all of you for coming. It is an honor to be here with the leaders of Ojibwe sovereign nations. At St. Ben's and St. John's, our institutional learning goals encourage us to live courageously. And when looking for examples of courageous living, we do not have to look any farther than the Native nations that continue to thrive in Minnesota today. The fact that tonight we can welcome the leaders from Native nations is due to centuries of courageous living, courage in the face of military campaigns, courage in the face of Native American boarding schools, which the United States used in an attempt to force assimilation by separating families. In fact, even our own campuses were once home to two of these schools. Native people have risked their lives as activists for their way of life and for the autonomy of their people. Tonight, each of our guests embody courageous living. They carry the torch of their ancestors, working to keep their nations thriving and self-reliant. My hope for tonight is that we can learn from your work to preserve your Native nation self-determination, and learn from the ways in which Native nation sovereignty can benefit both Native and non-Native Americans. My role tonight is just to facilitate dialogue. First, I'm going to start by asking each guest to speak for 3 to 4 minutes to address a question that will help us learn a little bit more from their leadership experience. Then I have some questions I'm going to pose to the entire panel. And I'm going to leave time at the end for questions from the audience, so please think of some good ones. My first question is for Executive Director Melanie Benjamin. Like the federal government, the MIAC has a separation of powers with 3 separate branches of government, an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. Your community is often referred to as the non-removable MIAC because they refused orders to relocate to the White Earth Reservation. Can you speak to how MIAC's history of fierce independence led the band to form a government with 3 branches?
I would be very happy to. And good evening, everyone. Anin Bonjour, Mondamin Benjamin, and Melanie Benjamin Indigo. And it is my honor and privilege to talk with you this evening, and to also talk about the MIAC Band of Ojibwe. And we do have what we call the division of powers form of government, and I had the executive branch. And in 1934, there was a law called the Indian Reorganization Act, and it went all across Indian country and wanted the different tribes to establish governments, and they gave us this framework. And if you look at that, I think they're kind of similar to like the American Legion kind of form of government type of thing. And so that's how the Mille Lacs Band became one of the 6 tribes, the bands, called bands, of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And in 1936, we had a constitution. And also, what was interesting about that at the time is that the reason they wanted all of those 6 bands to come under the umbrella of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe is because there was legislation at the time called the Nelson Act, and where they had the U.S. and a lot of different folks that came in and acquired a lot of the timber off of the reservations without proper processes, I guess. So there was an act where they had to reimburse the tribes for that. But at the time, the federal agents thought it was a lot easier if they formed one organization where the payment would go to one entity, and then they could disperse those funds, and then we evolved from that. And so in the 80s, our leaders did not like the way the reservation business committees kind of identified how our government would run. And they felt that we need a better way of governing. Yes, we were kind of more or less told to operate our government under the Reservation Business Council's kind of setup, but we wanted something different at the time. And the way our system is set up, a lot of folks will like to say it's a separation of powers form of government, and it's not. We like to say it's the division of power, because what had happened, if you look at our tribe, we have 5 elected officials, tribal chairman, and then we have a secretary treasurer, and then we have our district legislators, who we call district representatives. And so that's where all the power and authority, it was within that 5-member group. And Mille Lacs Band, our leaders at the time decided that we wanted to go back to more of a traditional way of how we wanted to govern, and that was really based on the community always had roles. And so what did that mean in terms of this government and how we really wanted to govern? We had the reservation business councils, but that wasn't the best approach for us. And so, but we also had to look at a way that we're the Bureau of Indian Affairs and other, our trustees would view how Mille Lacs wanted to govern. And so we looked at the 3 branches and felt that was a good model as well. And even though the United States uses that framework, it really came from the 6 nations, and I think most people know that as well. And so we looked at our system, and through our ceremonial life, we have what we call the Big Drum Society, and that's where we get our protection, our strength, our gift of life, and we wanted to model that. And so there's actually 21 positions that are in that Big Drum Society. And so our folks at the time, tribal chairman and our elders, they looked at that and said that has always worked for us for generations, so why don't we do that here as well? And so we have 21 positions. We looked at the elected officials, we looked at our judicial system, and we also looked at the folks that are there to help. And currently we call them commissioners, and they're appointed people within the tribe. And we move forward with that, where we do have the checks and balances, where I can't do anything in my day-to-day role unless I'm sanctioned by the legislative branch. And the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive department executes the law, and then we have a judicial system that will take care of any differences that we may have. And so we've been operating that form of government since the 80s, and it has worked very well for us. Also, what that does is we took our business and economic development arm and took it away and divided that power up to another group, so that elected officials did not micromanage any of the businesses we have. And the only way that we have a more or less input into how our government business entity works is that we approve their budgets. And there are certain levels of activity that they have to come for ordinances, resolutions, and things of that sort. And it has worked very well for the Mille Lacs Band over the many, many years. And so you know that anything you do as an elected official, that somebody else is there to make sure that you follow the statutes, that you uphold your responsibility. And so when you have a true government-to-government respect between your branches of government, it works well.
Thank you for sharing that. It's remarkable how, even though in some ways that, as you say, the division of power may resemble the federal government, that actually really came from within your own traditions and your own culture. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. My next question is to Cathy Achievers. In addition to serving as tribal chairwoman for the Bois Forte Band, you are also a businesswoman with a wild rice business that uses traditional harvesting methods. What role can tribal governments play in supporting Native-owned businesses, and how can Native-owned businesses contribute to the wider economy?
Good question. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here today. Nice to see you all here. Good crowd. The business that I have is a wild rice processing and somewhat of a distribution business, and the tribes we want to empower our band members and our people to either get job skills or become small business owners themselves. My family happened to be in the wild rice business for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. And it started with my grandpa and my uncles and my father. My father married into the family. And they ran what was called King Brothers Rice Plant out in Net Lake. Back in the day, wild rice was a huge economic boom for Net Lake. It was almost like kind of like the gold rush every fall, because they would get almost 500,000 pounds of rice off Net Lake. And how many of you know where Bois Forte is? Any of you? Oh, Joe, I know you do. We're located about 50 miles from the Canadian border. We're a small reservation, one of the smaller reservations. We have about 3,500 total enrolled people. Our lake is sacred to us. We do not allow motorboats on our lake, and we only do ricing and duck hunting on our lakes. We have an island that we call Spirit Island, where there's actually carvings in the rocks on the island, and so it's a very sacred lake, and our elders take care of it. And so this every year, every fall, we have wild rice harvesting, where the people go out in canoes and knock the rice in the canoe, and then they bring it up on shore and sack it. And then what we do is we process it, or they even take it home to process, and that means parching it. The rice you see in the stores nowadays is actually machine finished rice, either by tribes, even our tribe, or it's paddy rice. Back in the 60s, wild rice, like I said, was a huge economic boom for the Native people. Well, then the paddy rice industry came to light, and it ruined the industry for our Native people. I remember as a child going out to my grandma's, and when my uncles were running the plant, they'd rent canoes to everybody, and everybody would come out and bring their rice there, and they'd process it. And it was a machine finished. That's the black rice you see in the stores. That's machine finished. It's harder to cook and whatever. But the people would around the area would park cars at the. There's one road into Net Lake and one road out, and when every racing season, you'd see cars parked where people were trying to sell their cars because they knew the Net Lake people were going to have money because of the rice. And so, I mean, they really knew. But when the paddy rice industry came into play, it ruined the rice industry. And so now you can get rice for like $1.99 a pound or whatever. That is not good quality rice. The best rice, and these guys will argue with me, but the best rice is from Net Lake. He's with me. But basically, my business is hand parching, which is we take a 4x6 metal steel parcher, which is flat and then has about 4 to 6 inches up on the sides. And you put it on a wood fire and you cook that rice in there, about 80 pounds of it, for an hour with canoe paddles, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Then once you get that done, my mom would always come out and test the rice. And how she tested it is if you got 5 kernels to snap, it was ready to go. So we check the rice, we snap it, it was ready to go, we take it off the fire. And then we let it cool in a wood bin, then we take it to the processing unit. My dad had a thrasher machine that would put the rice, it's really kind of cool, it was hooked up to a drive shaft of an old Chevy pickup. And it's a barrel thrasher, and so there were rubber paddles in there, and when you put the rice in there to process it, it turns it into a powder, but it doesn't break a lot of the rice. It does break some of it, but it doesn't break a lot of it. And then you would have to fan it. In the traditional ways, they used to call it jigging the rice. The older people would take those tin buckets, and they would put them at an angle and put fire under them, and then they'd cook the rice like that in the traditional way. And then how they would process the rice is they would jig it. They would dance on it with their moccasins and get the hulls off the rice. And I was very impressed with your pottery art, your pottery guy, because for years we've been wondering what to do with those wild rice hulls, and he's incorporated it into the pottery. It's like, oh my God, I never thought of that. But I mean, I was just amazed. It caught my curiosity. But anyway, and then how they would do it in traditional ways is they would have a birch bark basket and it had a special lip on it. And what they would do is they would fan it. So they take the rice. I'll show you in just a little bit here. Kind of like this, and lift it up in the air, and the wind would blow. And that's what they would do for fanning. Well, we got a little more modernized, did the pickup doodad thing, and then we had a fanner. It's actually a piece of farming equipment, and it takes those hulls and blows it off, and the finished product comes out, and it's the wild rice. Wild rice is a Native American tradition, and a lot has been said about the sulfate issue with regards to mining. We're right in the middle of mining country. Bois Forte is, because we have Net Lake here, 50 miles from the Canadian border. We also have Lake Vermilion, or Tower, which is 65 miles apart. And this is in the 1854 treaty area, where the Mintac mines, all the mines are. And so I know that I'm kind of getting off topic here a little bit, but with the sulfate, it does affect the wild rice. We know that. And the governor appointed a task force, and he wanted the tribes to be a part of it this past year. And he allowed the Minnesota Chippewa tribe one representative on that board, and we said no. Each of us 6 tribes are different, and we should each be at the table. We're all sovereign nations, and we should each be at the table. He also forgot the Dakota tribes, and he also forgot the Red Lake tribe, because Red Lake is not a part of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And all the tribes should have been at the table. So what we did is we let the governor have his task force, and they still had some tribal representation on there. But we said we'll have our own task force, and we'll develop our own report when you do your report. Because I'll be honest with you, Native people have a better way of keeping track of what really affects us better than the state does. And so we did develop our report. We had all the data because we've been working on it for years. And our report was done before the state committee report was done. And it does show that sulfate does affect wild rice. So we need that wild rice. We want our businesses. We want our people to succeed. We want people to, spring into other businesses from the wild rice industry or any other industry. Tribes offer small business loans. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe does offer small business loans. And so there are opportunities out there, and our people just need to take them and grab them in what area they would love to do that. So if you want to talk more about rice, see me after this.
Thank you, Cathy. That was incredible what you shared about the sacredness of wild rice. That's its role in the local economy, but also its role in really food sovereignty and ensuring that in the case of your nation, Bois Forte, have healthy, nutritious food that has been produced from their own community. And you also raise a really great example of Native nation self-reliance in terms of, so the state has its own panel, its own researchers, and they're not operating in the true spirit of collaboration, of government-to-government relationship, and they're taking too long anyway, and just getting out ahead of them with that research. That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. My next question is for Karen Diver. You've served as the chairwoman for the Fond du Lac Band, and you've served in the White House as Obama's Special Assistant for Native American Affairs. How did your experience as an elected leader of a tribal government benefit your time while working for President Obama? And did it make you more or less of an advocate for the role of the federal government in the affairs of tribal governments?
Well, so
one of the reasons why the Obama administration started talking to me in the first place about coming to the White House at the end of the administration was because when you're a tribal leader, you're responsible for such a breadth of wellness for your community. You know, you are running K-12 schools, police departments, tribal courts, public works systems, scholarship department, language programs, on and on and on. Plus the corporate businesses, just all kinds of things that impact housing departments, that impact your people on a day-to-day basis. And all of it flows up to the chair position or chief executive position. So you end up really understanding a lot about community development and health and the role of economic development and how education feeds in that. And all of us, all tribal leaders, all we really want is for us to have our own self-determination and to have systems in place that allow for our citizens to have their own personal self-determination. But it's a lot of responsibility because everything that touches our citizens' lives, we end up really being in charge of for them. So it's a lot of responsibility too, and they're your families. The other part of it is the external, and we all have to be representative of our nations at the local level with cities, counties, townships, school districts, states, and then up to the federal government. And our message is always the same of tribes prepaid with the country, and the United States made promises back. So people say, you know, why don't you Indians get over it already? You know, and all of that. Well, where we are today as governments, we signed agreements, we paid with land, and in return, the federal government said, we will meet your needs for health, education, employment, on and on. Tribes are taking on the mantle of responsibility, but it's still created a responsibility of the federal government to be a partner with us in that. So whether it's legislatively through, the legislature and some of the work that Tad did on the committees or in the White House, that's really about implementing that promise that tribes already paid for through land cessation. So that gets us to the point. So was it a good way? Yeah, because there were other young Native people who worked in the White House, but they had great educations, they came from communities, but they didn't necessarily have that minutia of knowledge across so many different areas of responsibility. And then there is no circumstances where I will not be an advocate for tribes, and that includes with President Barack Obama. Sat right next to him and said, with all due respect, Mr. President, I have to disagree with what you just said. Here's why. And we had this discussion over dinner. I have to go home by the time my service is done in DC. And if you brought me in to be a special assistant to the president, that means I am to be your advisor. I would serve no one if I did not tell the truth and try to make the most of that opportunity. There were a few occasions where I was wondering where my line in the sand was. But if need be, I would have went home rather than been a part of something that wouldn't have been to the benefit of what we call Indian country. And I wouldn't have batted an eye about leaving. And I wouldn't have batted an eye about throwing them on the bus, under the bus on my way out either. Because we've survived enough. We've survived enough, and we're getting to the point where we're thriving. And not everyone is supportive of that. And we have to take the opportunities for influence where we can find them, but we also have to continue to call out injustice and oppression.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. I think there's a lot to learn from what you had to say about knowing when to take advantage of being invited to have a seat at the table, and knowing when you can make change for the good, but then also knowing when that seat at the table is not actually just having in your own mind what your own limits are in terms of when being there is no longer actually serving your community, and there's a lot to learn from the conviction you have in that. Thank you for sharing those experiences. Last but not least, I have a question here for Ted Johnson, and your experience in Indian affairs is really so varied, from working in the United States House of Representatives to serving as President Clinton's appointee to the National Indian Gaming Commission. What I'd like to ask you tonight is if you could speak a little bit about your experience from working as the counsel for the House of Representatives Subcommittee on Native American Affairs. If there's any experiences from that you think could help non-Native people understand the role of the House of Representatives, the role of the federal government in making changes for the better or worse for Native communities.
Sure, thank you for that, and thank you for welcoming Tommy to Johnny Vote. It's honored to be here. It's very nice that St. John's is getting into this topic, and St. Ben's. So, yeah, I guess when I first got there, I was right from Mille, from term one of being the Solicitor General. So I went out there. It was 1990, and the Congress had just decided a couple years before that. Ben Nighthorse Campbell was a Northern Cheyenne Indian from Colorado. He was in the House of Representatives at the time. He was a Democrat. Later on, he was a senator and a Republican. But he worked closely with Senator Inouye to get the National Museum of the American Indian built. But as they were doing that, a bunch of congressional staffers and congressmen and senators were touring the Smithsonian and the far reaches of the Smithsonian. And in the basement, there were 34,000 human remains of American Indians. The cavalry used to go out and collect human remains of American Indian people, funerary objects, and what they call objects of cultural patrimony. And so they were rather astonished, and the Smithsonian kind of said to these people, if you could just keep this under your hats. Well, there's nobody with a bigger mouth than congressional staffers and congressmen, et cetera. So the following day, it was in the Washington Post. And so something had to be done about that. But it wasn't just, as it turned out, the Smithsonian. A lot of museums all throughout the country had these human remains of American Indians. And so Congress had put together, this was Senator McCain's idea on the Senate side, and to pass a bill, of course, you have to have one side starts it and then goes over to the other side, and one committee, the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, has jurisdiction over pretty much every Indian issue in the Senate. On the House side, most of it goes to the committee on all the stuff the BIA and the Indian Health Service has jurisdiction over, but there is a subcommittee, and there was in those days. So we got this problem, and McCain put together a study committee for a couple of years to figure out what they were going to do, and that's after their findings came in is when I got there as a new deputy counsel on Indian Affairs, and I was watching my boss, who was an old hand at this. His name was Frank Ducheneau. He's still alive. Yesterday was his birthday. In fact, he's 79. So, and I keep telling him he's got to write a book, because he was there during all the passage of all these acts, from self-determination to the native, this one I'm talking about, and the Gaming Act and the Indian Child Welfare Act, all these big laws that the Senate gets a lot of credit for, but he was the guy in the House that worked on all of them. And he was my mentor. So anyway, I got to watch him, and I was kind of sitting there in the cheap seats watching him work this through. What we ended up doing was work on a bill that ended up being called the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And it provided for, if there are sacred sites on federal lands, Tribes are supposed to be allowed access there. There's not, if there's human remains there especially, and there's projects, federal projects going on around there, they have to be particularly sensitive to those. And particularly if museums have human remains, funerary objects, objects of cultural patrimony, they've got to figure out which tribe that has to go back to. And so every federally funded entity in the United States that has that, that issue has to find the right tribe to repatriate those remains to. And if they've got pipes, you know, objects that get buried with folks, they have to return all those to the right tribe too. Sometimes tracking down what tribes, this was a whole new cottage industry for anthropologists, and sometimes they can't figure out which tribe it is, in which case they go to the Indian Claims Commission map, and they figure they will return it to, if Mille is the closest tribe, they'll provide back to them. So anyway, but that was my first big thing I worked on. There were a number of other things that came down the pike, but that one was particularly memorable because of the rather shocking treatment of American Indians and the callousness of just going out and digging up bones and bringing them back east. And it gave me a whole new view of everything from the Smithsonian. And the fact that suddenly the latter part of the 70s through the 80s, through the 90s, tribes, the National Congress of American Indians, were starting to feel their strength, and getting American Indian staffers like Frank on the House side, Forrest Gerard on the Senate side, and then an entire Senate Indian Affairs Committee staff that grew stronger. And we saw tribal organizations get stronger during that time too. So back in the 1800s, when bodies were getting dug up and policies were getting made, American Indian people didn't have any say in it. I think all three of these folks have testified in front of the Congress, and now they don't make laws without talking to us first.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a remarkable story there about the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It is one thing that a lot of non-Native people are really unaware of, that it's up until very recently, Native American graves and associated objects and objects of cultural patrimony were basically treated as trinkets for collectors. And my own field of anthropology has a really long and dark history that's been a part of that. And while NAGPRA itself and its implementation is not always perfect by any means, the fact that it's been passed and that there are some protections that are there, as you mentioned, is a measure of the growing strength of Native nation sovereignty. The next questions that I have to ask are questions that I'm going to pose to the entire panel, and my first one here is, often when we hear about Native communities, we hear about the challenges they face. And it is important to be aware of those challenges, but we rarely hear about the successes of Native communities. And so what I'd like to ask the panelists, if any of you have anything you'd like to share about what you would consider to be a success from your community.
You know, people tend, I said a little bit of this in the beginning, that there seems to be a broader society kind of perception of Indian country, that there was criticism when we were really poor and dependent, and then as we became more strong and asserted our self-determination and built our economies and started building schools, now all of a sudden we're huge economic players in regions. And especially in rural Minnesota, if it wasn't for tribal enterprises and government services, it would have a huge impact on the areas of the 11 tribes in the state. I know Fond du Lac alone has about a $350 million economic impact on a really rural part of Minnesota. But it was actually Chief Executive Marge Anderson that said something that really stuck with me through the years of, I don't think we talk so much about our successes because, and she said, because we've never really had anything that we valued that hasn't been taken from us. Our land, our children, our language, our spirituality, our culture, you know, our families, our health, our well-being. So there's always this, I think, a little bit of internal tension sometimes, and it's not our way either to brag, right, and to toot our own horn. But on the other hand, tribes taking over their health services, the average age of death for a Native person in the 60s was 56 years old. Now, today, I think it's 74 or 76, something like that. That's because tribes have taken over their own health services. And it's because we're investing in culturally competent care. We're investing in prevention activities. We're taking pride where before we were beaten for language and not having access to our culture. Now those are sources of our pride, our strength, and our resilience and identity. And we know that that's what overcomes a lot of the stressors that our people have. So, you know, I think it's complicated, right? Because you have 300-400 years of oppressive federal policies and genocide, cultural genocide, actual genocide, that we're overcoming. And people expect a lot out of tribes that have only been able to self-govern since the 70s, 60s, 70s. This is only one generation of people, and we're already starting to make pretty incredible impacts on social indicators and what other people would view as deficits. Do we have a long way to go? Yeah, you don't erase 400 years with one generation of being able to have your own decision-making power and to choose how you invest in your community, whether it's with financial resources or programs. So, and then I just think that we're a little bit isolated. We haven't taught history. And so then people also don't pay attention to current day realities unless they seem to feel that they have some equities in it.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I was telling Ted about this a little earlier, and this involves two of my co-panelists here, but this started off as a really sad story, but we had a gentleman who had heart disease. He was actually not that much older than I am now, but he ended up having a heart attack, ran into a tree, and this happened. He died on a Saturday. For whatever reason, we couldn't figure out why, the Carlton County medical examiner wanted to do an autopsy on him by 3 o'clock the following day. And the state trooper said, well, he really doesn't need an autopsy. The accident was not caused by anything having to do with his driving or the car or anything. It was the guy had a heart attack and ran into a tree or a telephone pole or something. So anyway, I very rarely go to court, but I went to court with the Fond du Lac attorney. At the time, we got a court order saying that this man has a religious belief. And as Joe can tell you, there's a balancing test between the state's interest in doing an autopsy and the person's right to their religious freedom. And he was his belief was in the Medewan, the Grand Medicine Society. And in the Medewan, they don't believe in autopsies. They don't believe in desecrating the body after it's walked on. And so I got a call from the spiritual leader of Mille, Lee Staples, who basically told me, okay, you have to stop this autopsy. So You don't question guys like that. I just said, I was like, okay. I called Rebecca St. George. We wrote up, as best we could, a memo of law, and actually went to the judge's house, got a court order at 11 o'clock at night, stopped the autopsy. And then later on, the same thing happened at Fond du Lac a few days later. It was another Medewan person, a car accident, the same coroner wanted to do an autopsy. Later on, we learned this guy was getting paid by the body. That was why he was interested in doing these. So anyway, but we stopped that one. This time, Rebecca got the court, drew up the court order, went to court, and then a very rare occurrence happened because these two were tribal leaders. They deal with, well, she deals with Barack Obama. The rest of them deal with yeah. But I mean, they deal with people like at that level, U.S. senators, members of the House, et cetera. They don't mess with county commissioners that much. But Karen and Melanie and I and Rebecca went and met with, right. Rebecca St. George is the tribal attorney for Fond du Lac. So thank you. She helps me. So we all went and met with the Carleton County attorney, the county sheriff, the medical examiner, and the St. Louis County, same thing, same guys. We all met in Carleton County. And these two said, we're going to change the law because there's no way to intervene in an autopsy. And they're like, oh, we think that's a really bad idea. And I remember Karen looking at me and saying, they have no idea who they're dealing with, do they? And I said, no. And so the following day, I think, an op-ed appeared in the state's biggest newspaper by these two explaining how they're going to change the state law. And within a week, Tony Laurie introduced a bill on the Senate side. I think Reed LeBeau found a guy to introduce it on what was then the Republican-controlled House. And they ended up changing the law to the point. Yeah, in one session. All of this stuff happened. The first Mishku had passed in February of 2015. By May, Dayton had signed the new law. So that all happened. And Rebecca, the Fond du Lac attorney, and I, and that Emily girl that works for you, and I all wrote this law review article. Actually, she's my wife. Anyway, she's out there someplace. Yeah, I'm going to pay for that. But anyway, that was a success story because it was advancing. We had a bunch of religions get on board because we found out Orthodox Jewish people don't believe in autopsies, neither do Islamic people, neither do Hmong people, Seventh-day Adventists. There were a whole group of churches, but the law in Minnesota was such that you could not intervene on a medical examiner once they had the body. They basically owned the body in Minnesota. And anyway, so that was a success story because we ended up changing the law in a really quick period of time. And if it wasn't for these two, we couldn't have done that.
That's a remarkable story, Tad, and you as you share in there, there's a couple of things. One is the speed at which when Native leaders working together can go and change legislation, and then also how legislation coming, initiated by Native nations can then go and protect a whole wide variety of groups, the various religious groups that you just mentioned. That's incredible. And I also want to thank Karen for what you had to share in terms of first, in terms of measuring disparities, how those are beginning to close, but you also had a really important lesson in what you said, which is, I asked this question, why don't, let's talk about more of the successes and victories, and you noted those, but you also said that, explained that, there's a cultural value in not boasting, but then also a historical reason to be careful about boasting about victories. my goal is to kind of leave this very open-ended. I have additional questions here to ask. There also are if there are other stories of victories or successes that you'd like to share, we'd certainly would like to hear them as well.
I have many. Sitting here, I was trying to think what are a couple. So I have two I want to share, and it has to do with legislation. There, on many of the tribes across the nation, they have bureau schools, Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so Slate Gordon out of Washington State had put a rider on some legislation many years ago that said that the tribes could no longer expand their schools. For the Mille Band of Ojibwe, we live on a checkerboard reservation, and we have 3 districts, and one of our districts is like 80 miles away. Our tribal school is in District 1. The community that's 80 miles away did not want to send their children to the local public schools because a lot of racism, a lot of mistreatment, and things of that sort. So those families chose to send their children to District 1, which is an 80-mile one-way trip. And so we got to thinking, and the elders in our community, some of the old ladies, and we call those Minnemoyeg. And when we say old lady, it's not a disrespectful term. That's how it translates from Ojibwe to English. And so they would catch me and say, we don't like that. We want a school in our community. We want to be able to educate our own children. And so that was my task now, to look at our area and how are we going to bring that school to come under the umbrella of our tribal school through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And we're told for years and years and years that if you move a classroom or any of those out to that outlying district, that is considered an expansion, and so it's not allowable. So we said, looked at Tad and Emily Girl and other folks, and basically said, I want that school to be extended out to our other district. And so it was about a 3-year process where we actually looked at the data, we looked at how many students we had, we looked at how beneficial it would be for those kids that travel 80 miles one day to be able to stay home and go to a local school. And Betty McCullum was our sponsor, and I went out to the committee and testified, and we actually got that law changed where Mille Band was able to extend our school, the Neashing School, out to a district 80 miles away. And so that was a huge success, because now our kids can stay home and they can learn from their own community, and we can use the assets that we have there to educate them. But I have to tell you really quick, one of the other things, there's a lot of like those governmental successes that we have experienced, but one of the things that I noticed over the last couple of years that our tribal members that maybe are not what we see involved in day-to-day government, and we've had a lot of conflicts with our county, Mille County, over law enforcement and things of that sort, where they wouldn't recognize our inherent right to have a law enforcement, so we can have our own people serve and protect our people on a reservation. And that's a whole big story by itself. But because the Mille Reservation was viewed as a no police zone, that we had gang members, drug dealers from Minneapolis, from Chicago, from Detroit, end up on our reservation, selling drugs, doing all the activities that go along with that. And so in turn, we had people starting to get addicted to the opioids. And then from that part, we had a lot of the social ills that come along from being addicted, where children are taken away from their families, and people are overdosing and dying and things of that sort. So it was very devastating for our small community to witness that, because every person that died is someone that we all know and have an involvement of some way with them. And so to me, one of the proudest moments in successes that I think as a government was watching our people kind of look at what I call the new warriors. There was that's where they decided to step up and take control over the situation. So what happened, we had one of our members that was been in jail due to drug use and violations with the law and things of that sort. And this young man decided that he was going to change and he wanted to start to lead a better life. And so he set up these meetings, and is there anybody like me? I mean, is there anybody else that wants to now contribute to the community in a positive way? And he went for many, many, many months without anybody showing up to be a part of that, where they could support each other. Then one day somebody else showed up. And then there was two of them. And then pretty soon other people showed up, and they have a large group. Well, what they decided, what do we call ourselves? Because what they were doing, if they knew of family members or friends in a community that wanted help right now due to their drug abuse, that they wanted to be there to help those people, to send them to drive them to a detox center, to help them fill out forms, and to wait for them when they got out of a detox center to take them to a treatment place, whatever that would be. And so they decided to call themselves the Sober Squad. And this is a grassroots organization that has gotten together that currently have about 3,000 members throughout on Facebook that support and work in their communities to help people of addiction, to try to provide any kind of support they can to end this drug abuse. And to me, that's when you look at what individuals can do in a community by having commitment and the love and compassion for their fellow tribal member, it's unbelievable. And there's chapters that are sprung up across the whole state of Minnesota now and the country. And we just had the House committee came to MIAC and talked about opioids, and he was one of our witnesses. And it was kind of interesting because those elected officials at the state level said, what can we do? What can we do to help you be successful? And that was a very proud moment for me to see that an everyday person is willing to step up and really make change in the community. And we have a lot of folks like that, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out here in the crowd that I know are going to have such a huge impact on their communities when they graduate and go back home. And so one little piece of good things that you can do for your community really goes a long way.
Thank you.
Okay, last but not least. What I want to talk about successes basically is across Indian country, not just specifically for Bois Forte, but I will mention Bois Forte. Like I said, we're very isolated and rural. We're a smaller tribe. As an example, for us to go get groceries, 65 miles one way. That's where we go get groceries, go to a movie theater, go bowling. That's where we live. Out in the middle of nowhere. That's what she told me earlier. You live out in the middle of nowhere, she said. I said, yeah, but it's God's country. You know, and so transportation is a huge issue, but I really believe that all the tribes have great successes because we're underfunded by the federal government. And through our gaming dollars, and please, there's a misconception out there about gaming dollars and revenue. All tribes are not rich off gaming. We're all not the Shakopee tribe. Mille Lacs has done very well, and Fond du Lac has done very well. Bois Forte, as an example, we're a smaller tribe. We have one casino. It's not in a major roadway. We're marketing our destination, our lake, and our golf course. And so we're not very fortunate to have the revenue that bigger tribes do. So we have to fund our services for our people. That's our success story. Because right now we have 2 clinics. We have one in Net Lake, one in Vermilion. We opened up a pharmacy on each reservation, on each sector of the reservation. We have chemical dependency. We have all these programs and services. And right now the health services we know is only funded at 40% of the need. So who's going to make up that 60%? Right now, through our third-party revenues and possibly through gaming, we have to fund our programs to get those services to our people. That's our success story. And it's really, our people need the services. We have a public transportation program now where we work with people in surrounding communities to help them with their needs. Plus, we bus our people to work at our casino. Transportation is huge in our area. We just got, my internet at my home, my grandson told me, is slower than dial-up. Okay? We don't have good internet. We don't have a lot of what you have down here. And so it's difficult for us, but those are our successes, is using our revenue to help our people and those services that we provide. We have our own fire departments now. We have our own ambulance programs now. We used to have to wait at least an hour for an ambulance, but we have our own ambulance now. So those are our success stories. And we're very proud of them, but yet the federal government is responsible still for that trust and treaty obligation. We won't let them go on that, but we have to do something for our people. So that's our success story, and along with the other tribes. Miigwech.
Thank you for sharing that. That's remarkable in terms of thinking, providing the basic services like fire and ambulances. That is a remarkable success. And Melanie Benjamin, thank you for sharing that as well about the successes of individuals coming together and finding ways to help each other recover, and then how that then grew into something much bigger nationwide, which is really a wonderful thing. It kind of, in the interest of time, I have one question that I want to ask the panel, and then I'm going to open up things for to the audience for questions here. And my final question for all of you is that we often ask our students to dream big and imagine kind of the future that they would want. And so I'd like to ask each of you to dream, to tell us what your big dreams are about what you would like your communities to look like in 20 or 30 years.
We have a phrase in Ojibwe. It's called Bamadiziwin. And what that translates into is the good life. And so when I think about that in the people that I serve, I want them to have the good life. That means a safe community. It means where the kids are raised by their own parents and their grandparents. It means that we have job opportunity. It means we have our folks going to colleges to learn best practices and bring those back to the reservation so we can be successful. It means that we want our lake. We live on the shores of the Mille Lake. We want that lake to be clean. We want what the spirits, what we call the money do, what they provide for us, we want those to be in abundance so that we can continue on. And we want that the land to be taken care of in the best possible way. And I want our young people to have hopes and dreams. And I want them to look into the future and say, today, I'm going to learn all the best skills that I can so I can be a leader, so I can take the tribe into the future in a positive way. And we say what we do today has an impact 7 generations out. So what we're doing today, that 7 generations will feel that impact, whatever that may be. And so we want that phrase, the good life, Bamadiziwin.
I can't believe she turned on a mic. What I want to see in 20 or 30 years, and I'm sure we all do, is our language and culture back. Our people speaking 100% Ojibwe and practicing our culture, because right now it's struggling to come back, but it's coming back slowly. But in 20 to 30 years, I'd love to see our children speaking and our families speaking and living and doing our cultural ways.
So that's a wonderful dream, and I know there's some really so there's some really exciting revitalization efforts going on right now for language and cultural revitalization. Thank you for sharing that. We have about 10 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is to hear what questions we have from the audience. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and then someone will bring a microphone to you.
Raise your hands high, please. I have a question about rice that I'll ask you afterwards, but we talked about boarding schools at the opening, and do you think that institutions like St. Ben, St. John's that have had histories of boarding schools that stripped away culture for generations should provide some sort of reciprocity or some sort of benefit to like children now that are looking for education, or do you believe that there should be some sort of responsibility held by the institutions that have a history of that?
I agree 100% with that statement that it should happen. And in our community, because we live very far in the woods as we grew up, that when the Indian agents or some of the religious people would come around, and what the goal was to take the kids and put into boarding school in our community, that first family, when they stopped there to say, hey, you know, it's time for your kids to sign up for boarding school, what they used to do is, what they told me is that they used to blow whistles. And so that was the message to the other families: take your kids and run, because they're here to take them away. And so in my specific community, it's called Ojibwe, a lot of our parents did not go to boarding schools.
Yes, it's a part of atonement, right? And without acknowledging it and the role of proselytizing and what that did to traditional life ways and our own spirituality, that's identity. And it continues to impact our communities today in terms of how we build resilience and our own, reclaim our own life ways. This was a third of Indian kids across the United States through the boarding school eras. It's from the mid 1800s up until the 1970s. So this isn't long time ago. This was our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And in some cases, even some our age. So this isn't a distant past. And where religion has been used as agents of government for oppression and assimilation, they have to say the words out loud. They have to say it out loud, and then they have to back it up with actions. And I work at College of St. Scholastica right now. I am a challenge to them on a regular basis. But they knew what they were getting when they asked me to be there, and when they said that they wanted to make a commitment to Native learners and to Native communities, I believed them when they said that. And without putting too fine a point on it, religions have an immense amount of wealth, and a lot of that was also acquired off of indigenous resources, and it's time to pay it back now in equity and justice.
Okay. We have time for another question.
Hey, Ted. I have a related question. You talked about NAGPRA and the requirement for government agencies to return human remains and other sacred objects in their possession. Is there anything similar required or any progress being made as far as non-governmental private organizations, colleges and universities, private museums, or does it depend strictly on the individual initiative?
It's a good question. The main hook of NAGPRA is if the institution receives any federal funding at all, which most universities do in some form, then they fall under the aegis of that federal law. And I'm guessing if they have some affiliation with a church, for example, there's probably some moral leadership there that there's also always the question of what's the right thing to do. So, and I can't top anything about that Karen has mentioned about the obligations of different faiths.
Next question. We do have one up in the front here.
I was wondering about this question since we were talking earlier and talking about photos of family members that places like institutions like St. John's and St. Ben's might have because of the boarding schools that used to be here. So kind of similar to the question that Johanna asked, I had been thinking, and maybe if you could think of specific examples or generalizations, I don't know, but ways in which St. John's, St. Ben's, with our history, can use our resources or student workers or something to collaborate or, yeah.
So not all bad, right? I mean, so we were talking when we first came here that when the missions were first being established, that the religious folks kept diaries and about their interactions with the indigenous folks here, and that could be really helpful to us in terms of areas where we used to gather, where we had homesteads, because we have to manage our tribal historic properties, right? And that's a part of NAGPRA and some of the federal requirements around permitting issues, and it's documentation that would survive the test of litigation and meet the standards of Western government and how we make rules, right? So that would be useful. And then for a lot of these kids that went to boarding schools, those are our ancestors. And I use the story of my own dad. Him and his brother got taken when they were 6 and 5. They didn't come here, but we have no photos of them. The families moved around a lot, things like that. And so his first photo we have of him is 17 years old. And so that's why we got excited about Chairwoman Chavers, is that your grandma, right? A picture of her, because we just don't have pictures of the kids that stayed on the reservation, let alone the ones that got taken. So it might actually be missing pieces of our family's history here. So where you can chronicle who the students were, what tribe they came from, and then start attaching it to any of your archival issues. Even if it's a report card, how cool would that be, right? Talking about what they were good at or anything like that. So our families are here, and in our communities, they'd like to hear about how they did.
As far as collaboration, each reservation has what they call a TIPO person. It's a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. So each of the bands, Fond du Lac, Mille, Bois, Forte, White Earth, Grand Portage, we all have TIPO officers. They would be the main contact for collaborating with any agency that has any type of documents or anything that could be used at our tribe. So I would use them as a resource.
Thank you. These have been fantastic questions. I do want to say as well that as part of St. Ben's and St. John's becoming community grants from the Mille Foundation, and this is some work that I've been a part of, is that we've just begun looking in our archives to be able to see what's in there, and begun reaching out. We've had some conversations about this earlier today, reaching out to see what do we have that could be of use to you, and I look forward to continuing to develop those relationships. We do have time for one more question. I do see a hand in the back there that's been up.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. One of my ancestors was one of the missionaries from the University of Father Thomas Borgerding. And I don't know a whole lot about that. We've talked about all the negative things. Were there positive things that came out of those educational experiences, and what were those like? We talk about St. John's. I don't know a lot of history of the boarding schools here. Can you shed any light on that, please?
I know that Lake Tower had a boarding school, and I know that some of the comments that were made by a former tribal council member with regards to his mother when she was there is that she actually got to learn to cook, sew, and do all those types of basic things that that traditional Native women didn't do. So she really got the skills to do like not really homemaker, but the sewing, those types of things. So that's a positive thing that I heard out of it, is that she really enjoyed that herself. So I know that was one of the things that I heard.
We still have the Little Flower Mission on the Blacks Reservation, and when you're going through 169, if you see the casino lights and you focus on that, you'll miss the Little Flower Mission Church. But we had sisters there that treated our people very well, and they loved her. And I know there's all kinds of various stories about her involvement, and some discipline was happened on a lot of occasions when they talk about that. But I think there was that support, and also some of the teachings that occurred through there that allowed these children to move on to like public schools and be able to compete and do well in schools as well. And some of those skills then allowed those people to secure jobs that were in the area, even if it was basically being a tour guide or whatever that may be, that helped instill some of the work ethic, even though I'm very sure that a lot of the parents taught that as well. But to be able to live in that non-Indian world, and so there's a lot of positives that come out of that as well.
I do want to also share one thing about Borgerding, the ancestor who you mentioned, which is that in the 1890s, when Congress passed the Nelson Act, which had the goal of dismantling tribal ownership of their land, and that it ended up leading to the allotment of many tribes throughout Minnesota, especially the Minnesota Chippewa tribes. Borgerding served as one of the translators for the negotiations for Red Lake with the federal government. And one thing that I've learned is that the Benedictines don't believe in private property. They believe in communally owning property, which is something that the Red Lake believed in as well, and was trying to communicate to government officials. And in that case, while there were significant land concessions that had to be made, they were successful in being one of the few Native nations to not be allotted. And so you raise a really good point, which is this is a very complex history. There are some very painful moments. There also are some moments that are where there's some really deep and meaningful connections. That is all the time that we have. I want to thank all of you for your questions, and really thank our guests for being here. Okay, thank you.